So the mentalizing stance, this very much fits within the working with your client quadrant of the AMBIT wheel, but actually can be applied in any interactions with people that we have. So the mentalizing stance is kind of what it says on the tin. It's a stance to hold, or a way of being with, or if you like, a kind of an attitude to hold in relationships with people. And it can be used just as much in a kind of a therapeutic one-to-one encounter as it can in any interaction. It's a stance we can hold when we're having a quick chat in a corridor, when we're having a chat over a coffee, even in a letter or an email or a text message conversation. And there's another video as part of this series that shows a text message conversation where the worker's kind of trying to hold a mentalizing stance. And the idea of the mentalizing stance is kind of threefold. One, the worker in holding a mentalizing stance is modelling a bit of what mentalizing looks like, and kind of you hope in that way that you're encouraging the person you're interacting with to mentalize a bit more too. But it's also giving the client that experience of being mentalized, which we know is kind of the trigger to this thing we called epistemic trust. And then the third function is that through holding a mentalizing stance, actually you're kind of creating the conditions in which the client is a bit more likely to be able to mentalize. So the mentalizing stance is kind of a table, a bit like this. And the idea of that is that it's got four legs, and if you're not in balance, if you're kind of missing off a leg, then you're likely to topple over. So you're always kind of trying to be quite light-footed, paying attention to each of the four legs. The first of which is really typified by the behaviour of this guy, who, for those of you who don't know, is Columbo, who's a TV detective, and he had this particular style where he really kind of modelled curiosity and not knowing, and that's the main point of this kind of curious, inquisitive stance. That's the first leg of the mentalizing stance. So he used to do this thing where he'd go, "Oh, I'm really struggling to understand this. Can you help me to understand?" And this almost a kind of an open source thinking, sharing his process and thinking out loud, showing himself, trying to make sense of this usually a murder case or something. And in fact, he was a bit disingenuous because he usually knew exactly who did it and was kind of pretending not to know. What we're looking for in the mentalizing stance is a much more kind of genuine knowing that we don't know, but being curious. The next kind of leg of the mentalizing stance is this idea of holding the balance, or holding lots of different balances. It's a bit like kind of being a weeble, sort of trying to stay in balance, but leaning over to lots of different areas. So it might be that you want to hold the balance between thinking about your client's emotions, but also their thoughts and behaviours. And it's important to make sure you're holding the balance between thinking about a client's internal world, but kind of also the whole context that they're living in. If you're thinking about relationships, are we paying attention as much to kind of the client's thoughts as the other people, maybe in the family or the situation? And in fact, for me, as I'm having conversations, am I making sure that at times I'm really trying to make sense of what's in the mind of the client, but also kind of just stepping back for a moment and making sure that I'm keeping mentalizing myself and thinking about how I'm responding to the situation. Another kind of balance that you want to hold is between being quite narrow in our focus, which we can get sometimes in conversations, almost like a kind of a camera that's zoomed in. You want to make sure that at times in the conversation we're just kind of zooming out and looking at the whole picture. So this is really trying to keep mentalizing, keeping lots of different perspectives on something. Then the next one is quite an active stance, this, and we call it punctuating non-mentalizing. And the idea is that if we have an assumption that helping people to be a bit more in a state of mind where they're able to mentalize is helpful, then actually we don't want to get into a conversation where we're kind of letting someone stay in that state where their emotions are quite high and their capacity to mentalize is low. So we're kind of taking a range of steps, really, depending on the situation, to just to try and help that person move away from this non-mentalizing frame of mind, whether it's being very certain, being in pretend mode, or being very kind of quick fix or teleological in their thinking. And that might range from kind of just shifting the conversation slightly and asking a curious question, right down to the, cool, whoa, hold on a minute, let me just try and make sense of what's going on. I can see that you're really cross and I want to understand what that's about. So we call that kind of much more active stance the kind of the mentalizing hand. And it can at times, people's fear is that could be quite invalidating. And of course, this is one of the balances to hold, that we do have to make sure that we're validating a person's experience. But if actually by the end of my conversation with someone, they're still just as kind of ranting and raving and certain about how awful their mum is after the argument that they had last night, then have I been that helpful if I haven't actually validated that experience, but then moved on to try and help them to think in a slightly different way and make sense of how on earth they got into such a tricky situation last night. And then the fourth and final stage is kind of the opposite of that, and is a much more kind of basic behavioural technique, if you like, that when we see something that we like the client kind of being slightly more in a mentalising frame of mind, that we mark it and notice it and maybe even kind of praise it a bit. And that might range from the kind of just reflecting on what a client just said, oh, it's kind of interesting. So you're wondering if your mum was actually really frightened for you and that's why she responded the way that she did, into more obvious kind of praise, like, oh, I like the way you're thinking about that now. That seems to me to be a bit different to how you were thinking about it before. And so I guess the other balance that you're trying to hold is this balance of holding on to these four areas of the stance, in that if all I ever did was kind of punctuate non-mentalizing, that's not necessarily that helpful. If all I ever do is kind of ask lots and lots of curious questions, but I don't do the other bit, that's not so helpful. So in another video, we've got an example of this, and on YouTube we've got examples in various settings of workers holding a mentalizing stance.